Hey, Rick Tryon here with BibleRebel.com. This is the fourth video in our series called Bible 101, where we've been talking about how we got the Bible and sort of how to understand it better. In our previous episode, we talked about how the Bible is 66 books, so you can kind of think of it as a library of books, and how the basic division is the Old Testament and the New Testament. In today's video, I want to have a discussion about that first part, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. And we'll talk a little bit today about what it is and how to better understand it when you read it, and to know your place in the whole story, know where we are when we read the Bible and the story, and know where we are in 2025 here in the grand scope of the whole story that the Bible tells. And what that story is, the whole Bible, if you think of it as a grand theme or a grand story, it's about how God desires to redeem and recover his creation and his people, and to bring them into an everlasting, eternal relationship with him in a new creation. That's the whole story. If we look at that story in terms of a part one and a part two, we can see the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, as part one, and the New Testament or the New Covenant as part two. The Old Testament begins with the book of Genesis, and it ends with the book of Malachi. And that is the canon of the Old Testament, 39 books in there. But what I want to do today is just have a little conversation and discuss some tools to help you when you read or you think about or you're studying in the Old Testament, how to really better understand it. So again, if we go back to the big story, the Old Testament is part one, the New Testament part two. Part one is a story about how God called out a certain people, Israel, the Jewish people, the sons of Jacob, called them out, the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who was later called Israel. And he called that people out for a specific purpose, to be his light to the nations, to bring his glory to the nations, and to love him and to serve him. And so that is what the Old Testament is about. The Old Testament is about God's relationship with his people, Israel, and his purpose for them being a light to the nations and being his people to bring about his ultimate purposes for his creation. And so the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, contains a lot of the history of the Jewish people and their relationship with God. And sometimes they were pretty good, but most of the time they weren't so good. And so that whole story in the Old Testament, part one of the bigger story, is about the ups and downs and the successes and failures of Israel, the Jewish people, God's called out people, in their relationship with God. Now, one of the things that we really want to understand about the Old Testament here is that when we say Old Testament, we mean covenant, and a covenant is the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant is a set of terms which with God dealt with his people, or agreed with his people, and they agreed with him. So the terms of that covenant, you'll find a lot in the Old Testament. And so it's the terms of the covenant, and then it's the history of God's people and his relationship with them as they tried to live up to that covenant. And that covenant was basically this, that God would bless and take care of those people and bring them to success and to a great fulfillment of his purposes if they would follow the terms of the covenant. So some people know that covenant as the law. the law of the Old Testament. And like I said here just a second ago, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, were successful sometimes, but most of the time they were not successful in keeping their end of the covenant. So here's the main takeaway. When we read the Old Testament, we are not the people that God made that old covenant with and that agreed to live up to it. We are different. In 2025, after the birth, the life, the death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, it's a new covenant. The Old Testament is before that. Think of it this way. If you live in a house and you live by certain terms in your rental agreement, you have to live by those terms. Let's say you move out of that house and you move into a new house, you have a new set of terms. So here's what I want you to know about the Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament, we can learn from those terms and from the history and some of the things in the Old Testament, but we are not bound by those terms. We have moved into a new house, and we don't live by the terms that we live by or that they live by in the old house, in the old covenant. So that's basic to understanding the Bible, and it's basic to understanding part one of the story. So next time, I want to get into part two of the story, which is the New Testament or the new covenant, the new house we've moved into. Stay tuned. I'll see you then.